The desert was silent when he was born. Not the silence of peace, but the breathless stillness before a storm, a stillness that made even the stars seem to watch. The midwives whispered that the wind had stopped blowing for the first time in living memory. The Nile's current slowed, reflecting a crimson eclipse that bathed the palace walls in blood-red light. That night, Egypt believed it had witnessed the birth of a god. They named him Neferkare, the beautiful spirit of Are. The priest chanted his name for 3 days, their voices echoing through sandstone corridors as incense thickened the air. Statues of falcons and lions gleamed with oil as if awakened to new purpose. And somewhere in the shadows, an old high priest whispered to himself, "Thanks for listening to Boring for Sleep. If this story helped you drift away, please subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments." The gods have made another promise. And like all their promises, it will end in ruin. Neferkare's childhood was carved from gold and loneliness. He walked through gardens of lotus and myrrh, but was never allowed to touch the earth barefoot. The sand was sacred, they said, the dust of gods. But even as a child, he longed to feel the Nile's cool mud between his toes, to know what it was like to be mortal. Every morning, he was led to the temple to watch his own statue being polished by servants who could not meet his eyes. He was told that he was the bridge between heaven and earth, that his breath was divine, that his words could make the sun rise. But when the sun failed to rise one dawn after a storm, and the sky remained gray and heavy, Neferkare cried. And for the first time, his tutors struck him, not because he had disobeyed, but because gods do not cry. At 10 years old, he saw death for the first time. A farmer, caught stealing grain from the temple storehouse, was dragged before him. The priests made the boy Pharaoh watch as the man was sentenced to die. The farmer begged not for mercy, but for his son to be fed. That night, Neferkare could not sleep. He crept from his chamber and found the temple steps stained with the man's blood. He touched it, still warm, and whispered, "If I am a god, why did you beg from me as if I could not hear you?" No one answered. Years passed. Egypt flourished, though its people whispered of omens, black jackals seen in daylight, strange stars appearing in the west. The Nile rose higher than ever, then retreated too soon. When Neferkare turned 16, his father, the old Pharaoh, died beneath a sky of lightning without rain. The priests declared it the will of Are. The boy was taken to the Temple of Light, anointed with oils, and wrapped in linen of white and gold. He stood before the high priest, trembling beneath the weight of a crown forged from sunlight and myth. The priest's voice thundered, "By the blood of Are, by the bones of Osiris, and by the breath of Maat, arise, Neferkare, Lord of the two lands, the living God of Egypt!" Drums thundered. Trumpets screamed. The city bowed. But behind the chants and the music, behind the endless ocean of kneeling bodies, a single thought struck the young pharaoh's mind like a blade. Asterisk. If I am a god, why am I so afraid? Asterisk. That night, while the city celebrated, Neferkare stood on the palace balcony, watching torches flicker across the city. He heard the Nile whisper in the dark, the same way his father had said it spoke to kings. But this time, it said nothing, only the sound of rushing water and distant drums. He felt something else then, not divinity, but the crushing weight of time. The realization that every crown was built on a grave, and that the gods were silent not because they were holy, but because they had already left. When dawn broke, the sun rose behind his crown, turning the palace walls into gold. From afar, his people saw their new ruler standing tall, a silhouette wrapped in divine light. They fell to their knees. They did not see his tears. And so began the reign of Neferkare, the last son of the sun, a god to his people, a stranger to himself. The coronation fire had barely faded when the burdens of rule began. Each morning, Neferkare sat upon a throne carved from obsidian and gold, its armrests shaped like lions devouring serpents, a warning to all who approached. The air around the dais shimmered with heat and incense. The courtiers spoke in voices soft as silk, their words wrapped in layers of reverence and deceit. He was 16, and already Egypt weighed upon his shoulders like a mountain. Ministers bowed low, priests kissed the floor before him, generals pledged their swords, yet every oath sounded like a chain. Every compliment hid a blade. From dawn until the fall of the evening star, he judged disputes, signed decrees, and listened to prayers offered to himself. His name, once spoken in affection by his mother, now thundered from 1,000 throats as ritual. "May Neferkare live forever!" they cried, and he wondered if forever was a blessing or a curse. In the evenings he sought solitude in the Hall of Scrolls. There he met Mentuhotep, the high priest of Ra, who had served 3 kings and survived them all. The old man's eyes were clouded with wisdom and weariness. "Majesty," said the priest one night, "you have been given the power of the sun. But remember, the sun gives life only because it burns itself." Neferkare asked softly, "Then must a god suffer to rule?" Mentuhotep smiled, his wrinkles deepening like the fissures of an old temple. "A god must learn to pretend." The boy king never forgot those words. Egypt in those years was rich, fat on the grain of the Nile and the gold of Nubia. Caravans brought cedar from Lebanon, lapis from the east, slaves from the south. The markets of Memphis gleamed with copper mirrors and the laughter of merchants. But beyond the deserts, darkness stirred. At the edges of the empire, the tribes of Kesh had begun to raid border settlements, claiming they too were sons of the sun. Their chieftains invoked old gods, forgotten ones, and painted their shields with the same falcon emblem as Egypt's. When the council urged patience, Neferkare saw fear in their eyes. When they urged negotiation, he saw greed. And when they urged war, he saw hunger for glory that was not theirs to bear. So he rose from the throne and said, "Then I will lead them myself." The army gasped. No pharaoh had ridden to war in a generation. Yet the boy who had never felt sand beneath his feet now rode at the head of 10,000 men, bronze gleaming beneath the unforgiving sun. The soldiers whispered of omens, that the sky turned gold wherever he passed, that even the jackals bowed. But Neferkare felt none of it. He felt only the heat, the fear, the pulse of his own heart. At night, he sat by the campfires, listening to his men tell stories of their families, their villages, their lovers by the river. He realized they feared him less as a god, and more as a child playing at one. When dawn came, the horizon erupted in dust. The tribes had arrived. The first battle of Neferkare's reign lasted a single day. The chariots thundered, arrows screamed, bronze clashed on bronze. The Pharaoh stood in his gilded chariot, his hands trembling on the reins as the horses reared and the world dissolved into chaos. He saw men die with his name on their lips, not in prayer but in terror. He struck his first enemy down, a man scarcely older than himself, and for the first time, the divine mask cracked. When silence fell, the Nile ran red for miles downstream. That night, victory songs echoed through the camp, but the Pharaoh did not join them. He walked alone to the river's edge, washing his hands again and again, watching the water darken. The moon shone on the surface like a cold eye. Behind him, Mentuhotep appeared silently, leaning on his staff. "You have done what gods must do," said the priest. "No," whispered Neferkare. "I have done what men do. I have killed." The old man looked at him for a long time, then replied, "That is the first truth of kingship. The second is harder. You will do it again." When the Pharaoh returned to Thebes, he was no longer a boy. The coronation fire had barely faded when the burdens of rule began. Each morning, Neferkare sat upon a throne carved from obsidian and gold, its armrests shaped like lions devouring serpents, a warning to all who approached. The air around the dais shimmered with heat and incense. The courtiers spoke in voices soft as silk, their words wrapped in layers of reverence and deceit. He was 16, and already Egypt weighed upon his shoulders like a mountain. Ministers bowed low, priests kissed the floor before him, generals pledged their swords, yet every oath sounded like a chain. Every compliment hid a blade. From dawn until the fall of the evening star, he judged disputes, signed decrees, and listened to prayers offered to himself. His name, once spoken in affection by his mother, now thundered from 1,000 throats as ritual. "May Neferkare live forever!" they cried, and he wondered if forever was a blessing or a curse. In the evenings he sought solitude in the Hall of Scrolls. There he met Mentuhotep, the high priest of Ra, who had served 3 kings and survived them all. The old man's eyes were clouded with wisdom and weariness. "Majesty," said the priest one night, "you have been given the power of the sun. But remember, the sun gives life only because it burns itself." Neferkare asked softly, "Then must a god suffer to rule?" Mentuhotep smiled, his wrinkles deepening like the fissures of an old temple. "A god must learn to pretend." The boy king never forgot those words. Egypt in those years was rich, fat on the grain of the Nile and the gold of Nubia. Caravans brought cedar from Lebanon, lapis from the east, slaves from the south. The markets of Memphis gleamed with copper mirrors and the laughter of merchants. But beyond the deserts, darkness stirred. At the edges of the empire, the tribes of Kesh had begun to raid border settlements, claiming they too were sons of the sun. Their chieftains invoked old gods, forgotten ones, and painted their shields with the same falcon emblem as Egypt's. When the council urged patience, Neferkare saw fear in their eyes. When they urged negotiation, he saw greed. And when they urged war, he saw hunger for glory that was not theirs to bear. So he rose from the throne and said, "Then I will lead them myself." The army gasped. No pharaoh had ridden to war in a generation. Yet the boy who had never felt sand beneath his feet now rode at the head of 10,000 men, bronze gleaming beneath the unforgiving sun. The soldiers whispered of omens, that the sky turned gold wherever he passed, that even the jackals bowed. But Neferkare felt none of it. He felt only the heat, the fear, the pulse of his own heart. At night, he sat by the campfires, listening to his men tell stories of their families, their villages, their lovers by the river. He realized they feared him less as a god, and more as a child playing at one. When dawn came, the horizon erupted in dust. The tribes had arrived. The first battle of Neferkare's reign lasted a single day. The chariots thundered, arrows screamed, bronze clashed on bronze. The Pharaoh stood in his gilded chariot, his hands trembling on the reins as the horses reared and the world dissolved into chaos. He saw men die with his name on their lips, not in prayer but in terror. He struck his first enemy down, a man scarcely older than himself, and for the first time, the divine mask cracked. When silence fell, the Nile ran red for miles downstream. That night, victory songs echoed through the camp, but the Pharaoh did not join them. He walked alone to the river's edge, washing his hands again and again, watching the water darken. The moon shone on the surface like a cold eye. Behind him, Mentuhotep appeared silently, leaning on his staff. "You have done what gods must do," said the priest. "No," whispered Neferkare. "I have done what men do. I have killed." The old man looked at him for a long time, then replied, "That is the first truth of kingship. The second is harder. You will do it again." When the Pharaoh returned to Thebes, he was no longer a boy. But Neferkare's eyes blazed. "Would you have me kneel before idols of gold while my people cry for bread?" The old priest bowed deeply. "Better they cry in hunger than blasphemy, my king. Because hunger passes. Blasphemy burns forever." That night, Nefer held her husband as he trembled, not in fear, but in rage. "They call us heretics," he whispered. "They call you a witch. But I only wanted the truth." Nefer pressed her hand to his chest. "Then hold it here. Truth lives where gods do not." In that moment, the Pharaoh realized she had given him something no god ever had, understanding. But fate is cruel to those who seek truth in a world built on faith. Months later, a fever swept through the land. The queen fell ill first. Her voice faded, her laughter turned to silence. The priests called it justice. The Pharaoh called it the end of the world. He prayed before the altar, not as a king, not as a god, but as a man begging the sky for mercy. For the first time in Egypt's history, the sun rose late. And when it did, the queen was gone. The city of Akare stood gleaming in the morning light, perfect, empty, and cold. The Pharaoh locked himself in the temple for 40 days. He neither ate nor spoke. When he emerged, his hair had turned white. He ordered the statues of the gods removed. He forbade the name of Ammonius to be spoken. And when the priests protested, he said only, "The gods are dead. I have buried them myself." For 40 days, the sun seemed duller. The air hung heavy with dust and grief. Even the river slowed, as though mourning its own reflection. When the Pharaoh emerged from mourning, He was not the man who had gone in. His eyes were calm now, but empty, like the deep of the desert where no wind ever stirs. He walked through his palace as one might walk through a dream, and his people whispered that he no longer slept or ate, that he lived only on incense and revelation. He began to speak of a vision. He said Ra had come to him not as a god, but as light itself. And in that light, he saw eternity, a place beyond the reach of priests and prophecy, where only truth could live. He called his architects, his scribes, his sculptors, and said, "Build me a city that touches the sun, a city that will outlast time, a city where man becomes God by his own hand." And so began the dream of eternity. From the mountains of the east to the quarries of the south, tens of thousands of men were summoned. They carved stone until their hands bled and their songs died. The road to Neferkare became a river of dust, and the horizon was crowned with scaffolds like spears reaching for heaven. Each night, the Pharaoh stood atop his balcony, watching the glow of torches in the distance, the labor of his dream devouring the stars. He no longer spoke to his priests. He no longer prayed. Instead, he dictated new hymns, hymns not to Ra or Osiris, but to the light itself, the faceless force that illuminated all. "The light needs no names," he said. "It shines on beggar and king alike. It judges none, and forgives none. It simply is." The priests were horrified. To them, this was not a revelation. It was blasphemy beyond comprehension, the Pharaoh declaring that the divine had no will, no mercy, no ears to hear. And yet, among the people, the idea spread like wildfire. For those who had starved, who had prayed to gods that never answered, it was intoxicating. If the light had no will, then perhaps fate itself could be broken. But the Nile did not return. The rains failed again. The fields cracked open like old bones. Hunger turned to fear. Fear turned to anger. At the gates of Neferkare, thousands gathered to demand grain, mercy, explanation, anything. But the Pharaoh no longer heard them. He had sealed himself inside the inner sanctum of his new temple, surrounded by mirrors that caught the sunlight and hurled it through the halls in beams of burning gold. He called it the Chamber of Dawn. Inside, he spent his days speaking to the light as if it were a living being. He whispered to it, pleaded with it, cursed it. His servants said he began to believe the queen's spirit lived within it, that when the morning sun fell through the mirrors, he saw her shape in the fire. At night, his dreams grew strange. He dreamed of endless deserts where the statues of gods lay half buried, their faces eroded, their names forgotten. He dreamed of a river flowing backward, carrying temples, crowns, and bones into the dark. He awoke each dawn with one thought burning behind his eyes. If gods can die, then so can eternity. And so, in defiance, he sought to bind himself to it. He summoned his artisans again and commanded the construction of his tomb, not beneath the earth, but within the heart of his sun temple, surrounded by light that would never fade. "Let no darkness touch me," he said. "I will not descend into the underworld. I will remain forever illuminated." The workers trembled. The architects protested. Such a thing had never been done. But his word was law, and fear is the most loyal servant of all. As the years passed, the Pharaoh's city grew silent. The laughter of children vanished, replaced by the rhythm of chisels. The markets emptied. Even the priests who once cursed him began to fear his power, not because they believed, but because they began to suspect he might be right. They said the Pharaoh no longer aged, that the sun itself preserved him. But those who saw him closely whispered that his skin had turned pale as stone, that his hair had fallen, that he moved as though his bones had become glass. He was no longer a man, yet not a god. He was something in between, trapped between heaven and earth, immortal and already dead. One night, a storm came, the first in years. Thunder tore across the desert, and rain lashed the temples. The people saw it as a sign that the gods had returned. But in the palace, Neferkare fell to his knees before the mirrors, laughing through tears. "Do you see?" he shouted to the sky. "Even the gods weep for me now." Lightning struck the temple spire. The mirrors shattered, raining fire and shards of light. And in that chaos he saw, for an instant, the reflection of Nefer smiling, her face calm, her voice whispering through the thunder. "Let go." When the storm passed, the temple was blackened, its mirrors broken. The Pharaoh was found alone, sitting in the ashes, staring into the rising dawn. The next morning, he decreed that the gates of Neferkare be closed. No one would leave, no one would enter. The city of the sun became a tomb of silence. And from that day forward, no one saw the Pharaoh in daylight again. We now descend into the great collapse, the moment when the God-King's light begins to devour itself. This is where Egypt fractures, love turns to legend, and immortality demands its price. The silence of Neferkare became its curse. For years, no traders came, no birds nested, no laughter echoed through its streets. The desert crept closer each season, swallowing the outer walls grain by grain. The wind whistled through abandoned scaffolds like the breath of forgotten gods. Inside the sealed city, the Pharaoh's servants moved like ghosts, pale, silent, obedient. They no longer spoke his name. They called him the Eternal Flame, for to name him Pharaoh felt too human, and to name him God felt too dangerous. Neferkare himself wandered the hollow corridors of his temple, speaking only to the light that no longer answered. Beyond the desert, Egypt bled. The Nile had turned thin and brown. The priests of Ammonius had regained their power, preaching rebellion against the mad Sun King. The old cities refused tribute. The army fractured, half loyal to the crown, half to the gods. From the east, foreign banners appeared, the men of Kadesh, riding under crescent moons and scarlet shields. They marched through ruined villages, their swords flashing like the reflection of fire on metal. And in every conquered settlement, they found the same thing. Statues of the Pharaoh with their faces broken, their eyes gouged out. The light of Egypt was fading. In Neferkare, the high priest Mentuhotep, now aged and frail, was brought before the Pharaoh one last time. He had come not to beg forgiveness, but to beg for Egypt. He bowed low. "Majesty," he whispered, "your silence kills us. The people are dying. The temples burn. Ra turns his face away. And this dream before it ends us all." The Pharaoh's eyes, once golden, were now colorless, like stone polished too long. Ra has no face, he said quietly. And I am not his son. I am his shadow. The priest trembled. Then let your shadow pass, Neferkare. The gods forgive. Egypt needs her king again. At that, a strange smile crossed the pharaoh's lips, the smile of a man who has seen too much. Forgive? He murmured. They forgive nothing. They forget. That is their mercy. He turned away. Leave me, old man. Return to your gods, if they still listen. Mentuhotep bowed one last time, tears glinting in his eyes. May they remember you kindly, Majesty. He was never seen again. That night, Neferkare stood atop his temple and looked out over his dying city. Once, the streets below had shimmered with torches and song. Now only the wind answered, carrying whispers of famine, of plague, of revolt. The horizon burned red with the fires of rebellion. He could have fled. The palace still had gold, soldiers, loyal chariots. But to leave Akare was to admit defeat, and gods do not flee. So he descended into his temple one last time, carrying only the staff of kingship and the memory of Nefer's voice. In the weeks that followed, the invaders reached the gates of Akare. They found them sealed with bronze, engraved with the words, Asterisk. Here the sun sleeps. Disturb him not. Asterisk. But men of war do not heed warnings carved in stone. They broke the gates. They entered the silent city. What they found was beyond comprehension. Every street was lined with statues, not of gods, but of people. Men, women, and children, captured in lifelike stillness, as if turned to stone mid-breath. In the palace, the walls gleamed with gold dust that seemed to move when touched. And at the heart of the temple, in the chamber of dawn, they found the Pharaoh. He sat upon his throne, motionless, robed in white. The mirrors that once caught the light had been restored, now cracked and blackened from age. His eyes were open, his lips curved in the faintest smile, as if he had seen the end and found it beautiful. Some swore they saw the faintest glimmer on his skin, as if light itself still lived beneath it. Others claimed his heart had turned to crystal. The soldiers fled, leaving the temple untouched. The new conquerors sealed the chamber, declaring it cursed. And so the Pharaoh's dream became his tomb. Centuries passed. The desert buried Akare in silence. The winds carried away the names, the songs, the prayers. Temples crumbled, gods changed, kingdoms rose and fell. But sometimes, when the sun rises just right over the dunes, travelers say they see the faint outline of towers beneath the sand. And if you listen, they say, you can still hear a voice whisper, the gods are gone. Only the light remains. Yet Egypt did not die. New kings came, and they told new stories. They called Neferkare a heretic, a madman, a blasphemer, and then, quietly, a visionary. His temple became myth. His name became a curse, then a legend, then a question that no scholar could answer. Was he truly divine? Or simply a man who loved too deeply, first a woman, then a dream, then the sun itself? And though the centuries would erase his city, his words would outlast them all, carved deep into the heart of stone, found one day by a wandering scribe. I sought the light. I became it. And it burned me. The world was gone. He knew it the moment he opened his eyes. There was no air, no sound, no weight, only endless blackness lit by faint rivers of gold. The sands of time drifted like smoke. Somewhere far away, a heartbeat echoed, slow and eternal. Neferkare stood alone upon a bridge of light, stretching across a vast darkness. His crown was gone, his robes torn, his hands bare. For the first time, he felt his body as it truly was, fragile, human, trembling. He whispered, "So this is death." The voice that answered came not from the air, but from inside him. "No, Pharaoh. This is the truth." The darkness parted, revealing a horizon of fire. The gates of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, rose before him, massive and terrible, guarded by serpents made of shadow and stars. He stepped forward, and the gates opened not with sound, but with memory. The scent of the Nile, the laughter of Neferu, the screams of battle, the silence of Akare. Each memory burned as he walked through it. The first to greet him was Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead. His eyes glowed like embers in the void. "Pharaoh," he said, "you built your city to escape me." Neferkare bowed his head. "And yet I am here." Anubis studied him. "Few kings walk willingly. Most cling to life until it rots. Why do you not beg for return?" The pharaoh's voice was quiet. "Because I have already lived as the dead do." The god inclined his head. "Then walk. But know this, you cannot rule the underworld. You can only be weighed by it." Through 12 gates he walked, 12 hours of night. At each, a guardian questioned him. "Have you stolen? Have you lied? Have you caused suffering? Have you claimed divinity you did not possess?" And to each, Neferkare answered, "I have done all these things. But I did them seeking the light." The guardians said nothing. They only pointed him onward. At last he came to the Hall of Two Truths, where all souls meet their end. The hall was vast, lined with pillars of obsidian carved with the names of the forgotten. At its center stood a great scale. One side held a feather of Maat, goddess of truth, the other weighted empty. Before it sat Osiris, lord of the afterlife, still as stone, crowned with eternity itself. And beside him stood Thoth, the scribe of judgment, his reed pen ready. Osiris spoke. "Neferkare, son of the sun, king of the two lands, builder of Akare, you who defied gods and men alike, what do you bring before eternity?" The pharaoh lowered his gaze. "I bring only what remains." He reached into his chest and drew forth his heart, not of flesh, but of light, pulsing softly. He placed it upon the scale. It trembled, shining with memories, the cries of his people, the laughter of his queen, the silence of the desert, the echo of his own pride. The scale tipped. The feather rose. The gods leaned forward. And then balance. Perfect, still balanced. Thoth's pen hesitated. Osiris regarded him. "Explain this, scribe." Thoth's eyes shimmered like ink. "His heart is not pure, but it is not corrupt. It is human." Osiris turned to Neferkare. "You sought eternity and found only yourself. Do you understand now what that means?" The Pharaoh closed his eyes. Yes. It means I was never a god. Only a mirror held up to the divine. The Lord of the Dead inclined his head. And do you regret? Neferkare smiled faintly. No. Because only in losing the gods did I see the beauty of being mortal. For a long time, there was silence. Then Osiris spoke, his voice echoing across eternity. Then go, Pharaoh. You will not walk among the damned, nor will you rest among the gods. You shall dwell between, as light between day and night, as memory between death and life. When men look upon the sun and wonder, they will remember you, though they know not your name. The hall dissolved. The scales vanished. And the Pharaoh fell, not downward but inward through centuries of light. He saw the future unfold like reeds parting in water. He saw new empires rise where his had fallen. He saw the pyramids swallowed by sand, then rediscovered by curious hands. He saw his name on broken tablets, misread, mispronounced, rewritten. He saw men build machines that touched the sky, each believing they, too, were gods. He smiled. Nothing changed. Everything changed. The light still rose. The river still flowed. And the human heart still searched for something greater than itself. When at last the falling stopped, he stood once more beside the Nile. The air was warm, filled with the scent of lotus and rain. The queen waited for him on the bank, her smile the same as the day they met. He took her hand. For so long, he whispered, I thought eternity was stone. But it was you. She smiled. It was always us. Light and shadow. God and human. The same. And together they walked into the horizon, two figures dissolving into the golden glow of dawn. Far above, the desert slept. The sun rose again over the buried city of Neferkare, painting the dunes in fire. And as the first light touched the broken spire of the old temple, a single beam caught within the stone, glimmering like a heartbeat, steady, eternal. A whisper followed the wind. I sought the light. I became it. And it set me free. The desert was vast before Egypt had a name. A sea of silence stretching to every horizon, where wind moved like an invisible god and the stars burned cold above dunes that never slept. In that silence, the Nile was everything, the only pulse of life, a ribbon of blue slicing through endless gold. Along its banks rose cities of mud and stone, and in those cities, men built shrines to the sky, hoping the heavens might notice them. One night, the heavens did. It began with the trembling of the earth, a whisper through the palms, and the cry of a newborn carried from the royal palace of Thebes, a cry so loud that it startled the falcons from their towers. The priests who guarded the temple of Re lifted their eyes to the sky and saw an eclipse swallowing the sun whole. The disk of fire turned black, rimmed in red, as though Re himself had bled across the heavens. That was the moment Neferkare was born. The scribes wrote that the river's current stopped for a single breath, a moment of perfect stillness, when even the crocodiles froze in the water. It was said the eclipse marked not a curse, but a covenant. The sun had given part of itself to earth. The midwives whispered blessings over the child as incense filled the chamber, heavy with myrrh and juniper. His skin gleamed bronze in the lamplight. His eyes were dark, but deep, the kind that seemed to reflect flame. The nursemaids said they could feel warmth radiating from his tiny chest, as though he carried sunlight within. When the high priest Mentuhotep arrived, he fell to his knees and proclaimed, "A son of Ra is born! His name shall be Neferkare, the beautiful spirit of the sun." And all who heard the name bowed until their foreheads touched the earth. From that moment, the child belonged to no one, not even to his mother Queen Merit. He was a vessel of the divine. His cradle was placed in a sanctum lit day and night by golden lamps. The temple musicians sang hymns to Ra beside him so that his dreams might be filled with light. Yet even gods cry, and when he did, no nurse dared hold him. They feared the old prophecies, asterisk. He who carries the sun must never be touched by shadow, asterisk. So he grew in loneliness. As he learned to walk, the priest taught him how to move in ritual precision, one hand raised toward heaven, the other extended toward the earth, symbol of balance between the divine and mortal. Before he could speak, he was made to memorize prayers in the old tongue, words older than the pyramids themselves. He was forbidden to run, to laugh loudly, or to eat with others. A god, they told him, must never be seen doing what mortals do. He would watch other children play in the courtyards beyond the temple walls, their feet sinking into the mud of the Nile banks, and though he did not understand envy yet, he felt something heady in his chest, something close to hunger. At dawn each day, he was carried to the rooftop of the temple to greet the sun. The priests would lift him high as the disk of Ra rose from the horizon, chanting, "Behold! The sun greets the Father!" The boy's small arms would reach out toward the light, and the people watching from the streets below would fall to their knees, believing their new god had blessed the day. But sometimes, when clouds veiled the sun, Neferkare would shiver. He would glance at the high priest and whisper, "Why does my father hide?" Mentuhotep would smile gently, but his eyes were cold. "He does not hide, Majesty. He watches to see if his son is worthy." From that day, Neferkare feared the clouds. When he turned 7, he was allowed his first lesson in statecraft. He sat beside his father, Pharaoh Khentiare, during an audience with the governors of the south. The hall was vast, lined with papyrus columns painted in blue and gold, the ceiling carved with wings of falcons. As the governors bowed, Neferkare noticed how their eyes flicked not to his father but to him, the child of prophecy. It made his stomach twist. His father spoke in a tone both stern and kind, resolving disputes, rewarding loyalty, and punishing theft. When one man begged mercy for a crime of hunger, Khentiare hesitated. "Compassion is the law's twin," he said. But Mentuhotep, standing in the shadows, whispered, "Mercy weakens gods." That night, the thief was executed outside the temple gates. Neferkare saw the man's body at dawn, hanging by the river, his eyes open toward the rising sun. He asked his tutor, "Will the gods feed his children now?" The tutor struck him across the mouth. "Silence," he hissed. "The gods need no questions." From that morning on, the boy began to doubt what holiness truly meant. The years passed like sand through a glass vessel. Egypt thrived. The Nile rose faithfully, bringing silt and life. Ships from foreign lands arrived at the harbors of Memphis and Heliopolis, their sails white as ibis wings. Gold from Nubia filled the treasury. And yet, in the palace, an unease grew. The old Pharaoh's cough worsened. The priests spoke of omens, scorpions appearing in the royal garden, a hawk dropping dead mid-flight. One night, Neferkare called for his son. They met alone in the Hall of Kings, where statues of ancestors loomed in flickering torchlight. "My son," said the dying pharaoh, "a king is not born, he is carved by duty. The gods will not answer you, no matter how loudly you pray. But the people will, if you learn to listen." The boy looked up at him, tears shining. "Father, am I not a god?" Neferkare smiled sadly. "Perhaps. But gods do not bleed, and I have seen blood in your eyes." The next morning, the old king was dead. The people of Egypt wept in the streets. The priests did not. They were already preparing the oils and linen for the next coronation. At 16, Neferkare ascended the throne. The coronation took place in the temple of Ra at Thebes. He wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, its white and red plumes shimmering in the dawn. Around him, the air was thick with incense and chants. Mentuhotep, now stooped with age, lifted the sacred ankh and placed it in the young king's hand. "By the blood of Ra, by the bones of Osiris, and by the breath of Maat, rise Neferkare, living Horus, ruler of the two lands, eternal as the sun!" The people cheered. Trumpets blared. Drums thundered like the heart of creation itself. But as Neferkare gazed over the sea of bowed heads, a strange stillness overtook him. He saw faces, thousands of them, bent not in love, but in fear. He realized that to them, he was not a man crowned by destiny, but a flame that could burn or bless. He smiled because it was expected of him. But in his heart he whispered, Asterisk. "If I am a god, why am I afraid?" Asterisk. That night, while the city celebrated, he stood upon his balcony overlooking the Nile. The torches of Thebes flickered below, reflecting in the dark water like stars fallen to earth. The air was cool. The moon rose behind the palace. Somewhere, a flute played a morning song disguised as joy. He closed his eyes and let the wind brush against his face. For the first time in his life, he felt alone, not watched by gods, not followed by priests, not bound by titles. Just a boy staring into the dark, wondering what part of him was still human. He whispered a prayer, not to Ra, but to the silence. "Let me see the truth, even if it destroys me." The wind shifted. The river's surface rippled. Far away, thunder rolled across a cloudless sky. The gods, it seemed, had heard. But they were not yet ready to answer. The sun rose over Thebes in a blaze of copper and gold. Its light crept slowly down the limestone pillars of the palace, washing across carved falcons and lotus flowers until it reached the young king seated upon the black and gold throne of his ancestors. Neferkare had worn the crown for 7 days, and already it felt heavier than stone. The twin plumes of Upper and Lower Egypt swayed above his head, symbols of unity and of expectation. Beneath the throne, the cool tiles were inlaid with turquoise meant to mimic the waters of the Nile, but the king's bare feet felt only their chill. He sat motionless while a procession of ministers bowed and withdrew. To his left, the high priest of Ra recited petitions in a droning voice. To his right, scribes scratched papyrus with the dry hiss of reeds. The scent of burning myrrh filled the chamber, thick enough to make him dizzy. This was not the glory he had imagined. Each dawn began with ritual, the lighting of the sacred flame, the washing of the divine body, the offering of bread and beer to the gods. The priests guided him through every gesture, hand to heart, hand to sky, until even his breath felt rehearsed. He wondered sometimes if the gods grew bored watching mortals pretend to know them. When the ceremonies ended, the throne room filled with petitioners. Farmers complained of flooded fields, artisans sought payment, generals demanded men and metal. Their words tumbled over one another like waves against rock. Neferkare listened, nodded, decreed, but his mind wandered. He remembered his father's warning, The gods will not answer you, but the people will, if you learn to listen. He tried. Yet the voices all blurred into one, fear. Everyone feared something: famine, thieves, taxes, curses, the wrath of the gods, or the wrath of their king. And he feared their fear most of all. That night, after the last torch was extinguished, he slipped from the palace alone. The corridors were patrolled by silent Nubian guards whose bronze spears glinted in the moonlight. They pretended not to see him. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of sand and distant rain. He walked down to the riverbank. The city slept behind him, a dark ocean of rooftops. Out here, the Nile murmured to itself, endless and eternal. Neferkare crouched beside the water, scooping it into his hands. "Father," he whispered to the stars, "you said the gods would be silent. But even silence has a sound. Tell me, what do they want of me?" The water slipped through his fingers, glittering like melted gold. No answer came. Only the croak of frogs and the creak of papyrus reeds. He looked at his reflection. The crown was gone, his face young and uncertain. For a heartbeat, he almost smiled. Then he heard the shuffle of sandals behind him. "Majesty." The voice belonged to Mentuhotep, high priest of Ra, his robes a shadow against the silver sand. "You should not walk alone." "I am never alone," said the Pharaoh. "You tell me the gods watched my every step." Mentuhotep inclined his head. "Then you know why I follow." They stood in silence. The old man's eyes were the color of smoke, unreadable. Neferkare asked, "Did you love my father?" "I served him." "That is not what I asked." The priest's jaw tightened. "Love is for men, not for gods. A pharaoh must be above it." "Then perhaps I am not a pharaoh yet." Mentuhotep's gaze flickered toward the eastern horizon, where a faint red glow foreshadowed dawn. "In time, Majesty, you will learn that a crown is a cage. The longer you wear it, the less you remember the sky." He turned to leave, but the boy king called after him. "Tell me one thing, old man. When you pray, do you hear them?" Mentuhotep did not turn. "Sometimes. But they never answer in words." The weeks that followed were filled with omens. A lion was found dead outside the city walls, its eyes pecked out by vultures. A comet burned across the night sky, trailing blood-red fire. The Nile rose too soon, drowning half the barley crop. The priest said Ra was testing the new Pharaoh. The people said the gods were angry. The generals said it was time for conquest, a gift of blood to appease the heavens. Neferkare summoned his council. They gathered in the Hall of Pillars, each man draped in linen white as bone. The debate raged for hours. Some demanded war, others peace. Finally, the young king stood, and the hall fell silent. "I will not be ruled by fear," he said. "If the gods demand proof, I will show them that Egypt's strength comes not from prayer but from its people. Prepare the chariots." A murmur rippled through the court, admiration, dread, disbelief. No pharaoh had led an army himself since the days of Thutmose the Great. Mentuhotep bowed his head. "Then may I ride with you, Majesty. But remember, even the sun sets." The army gathered at dawn. Tents lined the desert plain outside Thebes, a forest of spears and banners swaying beneath the rising sun. The scent of oiled leather and bronze filled the air. Horses snorted, restless, sensing the tension of men who would soon kill or die. Neferkare rode among them on a white chariot inlaid with gold, his hands gripping the reins tightly. The soldiers stared as he passed, their god made flesh, no longer distant in temple shadow but standing before them, mortal and unarmored except for the shimmering linen that clung to his skin. He raised his voice, and the sound carried across the ranks like a current through water. "Sons of Kemet! Today the sun looks upon you, not as servants but as shields of his light. The lands beyond the desert deny our name. Let them learn it!" A roar answered him. Drums pounded. The wheels of 1,000 chariots began to roll. Dust rose, veiling the morning sky. By noon they reached the borderlands, the dunes giving way to scrub and rock. Here the tribes of Kesh waited, their warriors lean and dark, painted in ochre and ash. They fought not for empire, but for hunger. They carried shields of stretched hide and spears tipped with flint. The generals urged caution, but the pharaoh would not wait. He stepped down from his chariot and drew his curved blade, its edge catching the sunlight like a line of fire. "Strike when I raise the falcon," he commanded, then strode forward alone until the wind whipped his cloak flat against his back. The enemy leader emerged, a tall man with scarred cheeks and eyes the color of storm water. He spoke in a tongue the pharaoh half understood, a mixture of plea and defiance. "Go home, golden boy. The sand is full of ghosts." Neferkare answered in the universal language of the sword. Their clash was quick and brutal, the ring of bronze on flint, the hiss of sand underfoot. The pharaoh moved with the precision of ritual, every motion one he had practiced in temple dances as a child. Yet when his blade found flesh, the sound that followed was not divine, it was human, wet and final. The enemy fell, eyes wide, and for a heartbeat the world froze. Then the desert exploded in screams. The battle raged until the sun stood overhead, a burning eye indifferent to the slaughter. Arrows darkened the air, dust mixed with blood to form mud beneath the soldiers' feet. Neferkare fought at the front, the reins of his chariot wrapped around his wrist, his arm burning from the strain. Around him men died with his name on their lips, some crying it as prayer, others as curse. When it ended, The plain was littered with bodies and shattered spears. The Nile wind carried the metallic tang of death. The generals hailed victory. The priests who accompanied the army began their chants of thanksgiving. But the young king stood unmoving, staring at the man he had killed first. A fly crawled across the dead warrior's open eye, and he realized the gods of both sides had remained equally silent. That night, campfires dotted the horizon like fallen stars. The soldiers sang victory songs, they roasted goats, and drank fermented date wine. The air was thick with laughter and relief. The Pharaoh sat apart, staring into the flames. The flicker painted his face with the same red hue as the eclipse of his birth. Mentuhotep approached quietly. "You have given Egypt triumph," said the priest. "The gods are pleased." Neferkare did not look up. "I saw no gods today. Only men killing men." The priest knelt beside him, placing a wrinkled hand on the sand. "Every god began as a man, Majesty. Divinity is merely the memory of victory." The words cut deep. The Pharaoh whispered, "Then what will they remember of me?" Mentuhotep's gaze met his. "That you burned brightly. Whether you warmed or scorched them, only time will decide." At dawn, they buried the dead, friend and foe alike, in shallow graves by the wadi. The vultures circled overhead, patient judges of men. Before the final mound was covered, Neferkare stepped forward, removed his crown, and placed it upon the sand. "Are, see me as I am," he said softly. "No gold, no throne. Only flesh that bleeds. If this is divinity, then may you share its pain." The soldiers watched in silence. Some wept. Others whispered that their god had humbled himself, and therefore grown more powerful. But the Pharaoh felt only emptiness, a hollow that neither prayer nor victory could fill. When he returned to Thebes, the city erupted in celebration. Bells rang from the temple towers, and petals rained from balconies. Artists hurried to carve new reliefs. The boy king driving his chariot, lightning in his eyes, enemies crushed beneath his wheels. He watched them work, unable to recognize the figure they shaped in stone. That god of triumph was a stranger. The true man still smelled of dust and death. In the evenings he wandered the palace gardens, where date palms swayed and the Nile shimmered silver beyond the walls. He spoke little. Servants whispered that their ruler had seen the face of Ra and returned changed. One night, unable to sleep, he entered the temple alone. The hall was vast and echoing, its columns painted with blue stars. The statue of Ra loomed above, its eyes inlaid with lapis lazuli that caught the faint torchlight. Neferkare climbed the steps until he stood before the idol. He reached out and touched the golden cheek. It was cold. Lifeless. He whispered, "I killed in your name. I bled in your light. Speak to me." Nothing. Only the drip of oil from a distant lamp. He struck the statue with his fist. "Speak!" The echo came back empty. He sank to his knees, tears cutting through the dust on his face. "Then perhaps it was never you who watched over Egypt. Perhaps it was always us." The flame guttered, and for an instant he thought he saw movement in the gold. His own reflection shifting, no longer crowned but crowned in fire. He fled into the night. Back in his chambers, he looked out across the sleeping city. The torches along the river glimmered like constellations reflected on water. He thought of the man he had slain, of his father's words, of the silence in the temple. The world felt vast and indifferent. And yet, within that vastness, he felt a spark, not of divinity, but of understanding. The gods may not answer, but life itself was the prayer, breath, heartbeat, motion. He whispered into the dark, "If I am to rule, let me rule as man first, God after." Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of lotus and rain. Somewhere far off, thunder murmured over the desert, a sound like the earth exhaling. The morning after his return, Neferkare summoned his council. The generals came first, gleaming in bronze and boasting of conquest. The ministers followed, their scrolls thick with numbers and praise. The priests arrived last, faces shadowed, their eyes darting toward the golden young man who had walked among corpses and returned crowned in silence. When all were gathered, he spoke only a single sentence. "The gods have given us land, not peace. We will honor the dead by tending what still lives." The generals frowned. No new campaigns, no glory. The ministers nodded in cautious relief. The priests exchanged uneasy glances. In the days that followed, he turned his energy to the river. The floods had been fickle. Famine hovered like a vulture above the fields. The Pharaoh ordered new canals dug, embankments raised, granaries built in every province. He worked beside the engineers at dawn, his linen robes streaked with mud. The laborers stared in awe. No ruler had stood ankle-deep in the Nile with common men since the first dynasty. One old farmer bowed and whispered, "May the sun bless you for stooping so low." Neferkare smiled faintly. "Perhaps it is not low, but closer to heaven." Weeks turned to months. The fields greened again, the Nile swelled, and Thebes rejoiced. Yet within the palace, the air grew restless. The priests resented his independence. The nobles muttered that the god-king had become too human. Rumors crept through the city like ivy through stone, whispers of forbidden questions, of a pharaoh who spoke to the river rather than to Ra. One evening, after a long council, he wandered into the hall of musicians. The chamber was quiet except for the plucked strings of a single harp. There, under the lamplight, a young woman sang. Her voice was clear, untrained, the kind that belonged more to wine than to stage. She sang not of gods or battles, but of the Nile itself, of its patience, its sorrow, its endless return. The sound pierced him. It carried the same ache he had felt by the river as a child. When she finished, the silence felt sacred. He stepped forward. "What is your name?" She turned startled, then bowed deeply. "Neferu, Majesty. Daughter of a scribe." "Your song," he searched for words. "It speaks like truth." She looked up, eyes bright as whetstone. "Then perhaps truth has been lonely." He laughed, a small, astonished laugh that echoed against the marble. The courtiers nearby stiffened, unsure if laughter was permitted in the presence of divinity. But the Pharaoh only said, "Let it not be lonely again." That night, for the first time since his father's death, he dined not in solemn ritual but in conversation. Neferu spoke freely, of the markets, the workers, the festivals beyond the palace walls. She told him what he had never been allowed to see, the heartbeat of ordinary life. As she spoke, something inside him eased. It was as if he had been holding his breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale. In the months that followed, Neferu was often seen walking beside the Pharaoh in the gardens or beneath the painted colonnades. She spoke without fear, and he listened without pride. Together they watched the sunsets blaze over the river, their silence filled with a strange, fragile peace. But peace is the enemy of power. Mentuhotep watched from the temple balconies, his face unreadable. He saw the boy who had once trembled before idols now smiling at a mortal woman, and he knew the balance of heaven and earth was shifting. One evening he approached the Pharaoh as he stood overlooking the harbor. "Majesty," the old priest began, "you risk much by letting your heart lead your crown." Neferkare did not turn. "Is the heart not also made by the gods?" "The heart is clay, Majesty. The crown is flame. Clay cannot hold fire forever." The Pharaoh smiled faintly. "Then perhaps the gods should have made me stone." The priest bowed deeply, his voice heavy. "They may yet." Time drifted like the Nile, calm on the surface, treacherous below. Neferkare's rule brought prosperity, but whispers deepened. The priests muttered that he had begun to question the rituals. The nobles claimed he spent too many nights beneath the stars instead of before the altar. Yet among the common people, songs began to change. They no longer praised only Are and Osiris. They sang of the living king who walked barefoot in their fields, who listened, who loved. In every tavern and marketplace a new name spread, the Pharaoh of the people. And though he smiled when he heard it, Mentuhotep saw in that name the beginning of blasphemy. On the eve of the great festival of Are, Neferkare stood alone in the temple. The torches flickered low, and the statue of the sun god loomed above him. He looked up into the golden face and spoke quietly. "Father, if I am truly your son, tell me, do you love your children, or only their worship?" The idol did not answer. He turned away and whispered, "Then I will find another way to love." That night he left the temple and walked to the palace garden where Neferu waited. The two stood by the lotus pool, the reflection of the moon trembling between them. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "if the gods tire of being worshipped?" She smiled softly. "Perhaps they envy us, for feeling." He took her hand. "Then let them envy a little longer." Far above them, unseen, clouds began to gather, the first of many that would one day darken the empire. But for that night, the young king and the singer stood side by side, believing that love could heal even the oldest silence. The moon shone down, silver upon their faces, and for a fleeting moment Egypt was at peace. When Neferu, daughter of a humble scribe, entered the palace as Pharaoh's consort, the air itself seemed to change. The whispers of courtiers fell silent, as if afraid to break whatever spell she carried with her. She wore no crown that first day, no gold, no paint, only a linen gown the color of dawn, and a single lotus flower in her hair. But when she looked upon Neferkare, the room bowed to something greater than rank. She smiled as if she already knew the weight of eternity he carried, and forgave him for it. The Pharaoh's advisors were horrified. A queen chosen by love, not lineage? Unthinkable. Yet Egypt had learned that their god-king's word was law, and his silence, more terrible than his command. So they called her great royal wife, and the scribes carved her name beside his on the palace walls. Neferkare, beauty of truth. But in the markets, among the people, she was simply called the singer queen. Imams were gently asked to preach about widows for a month, the holiness of guarding them, the shame of forgetting them, so that the city's strength would not become a theater for men only. And when diplomats arrived with eyes that wanted to see the future before it happened, he offered them tea, not maps. "We are pruning," he said, which is a gardener's way of saying, "We are preparing for fruit." Night by night, the city's pulse began to match the rhythm he had wanted from the first day, competence braided to compassion. Mercy without sloppiness, order without cruelty. The hawk came less often, as if trusting that the air beneath no longer needed instruction. On those evenings when it did appear, he saluted the bird with a small lift of his chin, a private treaty between a man and a metaphor. A crown of dust and mercy is indistinguishable from a city that sleeps without rehearsing alarms. Cairo slept. And in the sleep of a city, roads dreamed themselves longer, fields dreamed themselves greener, and banners dreamed themselves quieter. It is from such sleep that a people can be woken not into panic but into pilgrimage. Some men imagine kingship as a thunder that lives inside the throat. Others learn, too late, that a crown is merely a mirror that refuses to flatter. In the Latin kingdom, the mirror had been handed to Guy of Lusignan, who searched it for inevitability and found only reflection. He wanted the music of command without the mathematics. He mistook momentum for strategy, applause for obedience, and impatience for courage. Around him, the lords of the cross quarreled over old gravel as if stones could be baptized into better soldiers. Rumor of his temper traveled eastward like smoke that could not decide what it wished to become. It found ears in Cairo where Yusuf, now Salah al-Din not only by name but by the quiet agreement of a people, was practicing the art that terrifies noisy men, restraint. He did not meet smoke with fire. He met it with water, a federation of patience among tribes and schools, Kurds and Arabs, Turks and Egyptians, imams and judges and merchants whose piety was measured in fair weights. He gathered faiths as a gardener gathers varieties, each with its season, each needing different weather, all conspiring toward fruit. In Aleppo and Mosul, in Damascus and Cairo, his messengers moved like arteries, carrying the same sentence in many dialects: "We must breathe together or not at all." He wrote to emirs whose pride had taught them thrift with obedience. He sent gifts that were not bribes but recognitions, horses that fit a man's seat the way purpose fits a vow, armor tempered for a specific wrist, books copied for a scholar whose loneliness had become expensive. He invited jurists to argue publicly with commanders so that law would not learn to tremble. He praised poets but paid accountants better. Unity is not a trumpet, it is a daily wage. Across the border, Guy rehearsed indignation until it sounded like policy. His counselors, divided into factions that slept with one eye open and one hand on the table, found in his weakness a flattering utility. Each could claim to be the spine he lacked. Reynold of Chatillon, that caravan's wolf, coached him in the theater of insult. how to make a raid look like a sacrament, how to convert theft into prophecy. Bishops raised relics that had learned to be patient with politics. Knights oiled banners the way some men oil arguments, for frictionless violence. Sulla Alden watched them the way a physician watches a fever that wishes to boast. He gathered not only men but meanings. Sermons braided courage to courtesy. Edicts taught markets to prefer honesty over excitement. The army learned that victory was not a license to humiliate. This was the gathering of faiths, not merely sects and schools reconciled around a map, but capacities married to virtues, archers to restraint, cavalry to timing, generals to laws that would outlive them. He was building a country inside a crossroads. In councils, he spoke little and remembered everything. He placed a hand upon a map and did not press. He let his palm learn the topography while others argued. The temples in the north refused to send their tithes. The high priest of Ammonius accused the queen of blasphemy in a proclamation read before the old city. In the markets, loyalists of the old order fought with the followers of the new. And yet, through it all, Neferkare remained calm. "Every dawn begins with darkness," she told him. Neferkare believed her, until the first famine. That year, the Nile failed to flood. The fields dried, the cattle died, and the songs of labor turned to cries of hunger. The priests declared it divine punishment. The gods turn away because the Pharaoh has turned from them. They preach from the steps of Ammonius' temple. The queen has cursed Egypt with her voice. In the palace, Neferkare refused to yield. "We will feed the people with what we have. The gods can wait." But the grain stores dwindled, and rebellion whispered at the city gates. One night, as he stood beside her in the courtyard, Neferkare asked, "What if they are right? What if the gods strike me down for loving you?" She took his hand. "Then we will fall together, as man and woman, not god and worshipper." It was then, in that fragile twilight of empire and faith, that he loved her most. Because she had become not his salvation, but his reflection. The heat that year was merciless. By midsummer, the sand itself seemed to burn. The Nile shrank to a thread of silver winding through a wasteland of cracked mud. Crocodiles lay dying on the banks, their scaled bodies bloated and still. Even the sky felt hollow, a vast, white furnace with no wind, no mercy. From the palace balcony, Neferkare watched smoke rising from the fields where desperate farmers burned offerings, praying for rain that never came. The scent of charred grain and incense mingled in the air. Below, he could hear the distant chanting of priests calling to Ammonius, to Osiris, to any god who might listen. Beside him, Neferkare stood silent. Her eyes followed the dying river. "The gods are deaf," she said at last. "Perhaps they were always so." Her words hung in the heat like a blade. In the temples of Thebes, fear turned into fury. The high priests gathered before the great statue of Ammonius, the hidden god, their faces glistening with sweat and anger. "This famine is no accident," said one. "The Pharaoh has betrayed the old ways. He builds a city without walls, without worship. He has forgotten who made him king." Another added, "And the queen whispers poison into his heart. Her songs draw men from their faith. She must be silenced." So the priests began to stir the people. They sent criers into the markets, spreading tales of blasphemy and curses. They said the queen had stolen the breath of Ra, that her beauty was a spell, her voice a weapon. By night, graffiti appeared on the palace walls, crude drawings of a serpent with the face of a woman. In Neferkare, construction slowed. The workers, hungry and exhausted, murmured of omens, strange lights over the desert, jackals howling at noon. Some fled. Others stayed only because Nefer walked among them still, carrying water in clay jars, her hair bound with linen to keep off the dust. When one laborer collapsed in the heat, she knelt beside him, lifting his head gently. "Rest," she whispered. "The sun punishes even its children." The man blinked up at her, dazed. "Are you a goddess?" She smiled faintly. "No. Only a voice that remembers you." That night, Neferkare summoned the High Council. The hall of pillars was lit with hundreds of lamps, their flames swaying in the heavy air. Mentuhotep, now stooped and gray, stood before the throne. "Majesty," he said, "the people suffer. The gods are angry. You must repent. Tear down Neferkare, restore the temples of Ammonius. Bury your heresy before it buries Egypt." The pharaoh rose slowly. His robes shimmered like sunlight on water. "You speak of gods, old man," he said. "Yet when I begged them for rain, they gave me silence. When the people cried, they gave me nothing. If they demand obedience, let them earn it." Gasps rippled through the hall. Mentuhotep's voice trembled, half pleading, half accusing. "Majesty, the gods made you. Without them, you are nothing but flesh." Neferkare stepped down from the dais until he stood eye to eye with the priest. "Then let them see what flesh can build." The old man's shoulders sagged. "And when the sand buries it? Then it will bury them with it," said the pharaoh. He dismissed the council with a gesture. The priests left in silence, their faces pale. In the darkness that followed, rebellion took root. In the northern nomes, grain caravans were raided. Messengers disappeared. Villages that had once sung his name now spat upon his image. Nefer tried to soothe him. "They do not hate you," she said. "They are afraid." "They should be," he murmured. "So am I." She looked at him sharply. "Then fear will destroy us both." He turned away, staring into the night where the horizon glowed faintly red, the fires of unrest spreading like veins across the land. The queen's health began to falter. The famine had weakened even the strong. Her songs grew rarer, her laughter softer. Yet she would not leave the city. "Neferkare is our promise," she told him. "If I die here, let it be beneath its light." The physicians brought herbs and charms, but nothing eased her fever. The priests, sensing opportunity, declared her sickness divine retribution. Crowds gathered outside the palace walls, shouting for her banishment. Neferkare ordered the gates sealed. He sat beside her bed as the fever burned through her, wiping her brow with cool cloths soaked in lotus oil. The light from the window fell across her face, turning her skin translucent, her breath shallow as the desert wind. "Do not let them take my voice," she whispered. He gripped her hand. "Never. On the seventh night she awoke briefly. Her eyes found his. "Do you still believe in the sun?" He hesitated. "I believe in what it shows me." "Then look," she breathed. "Even darkness needs light to be seen." Her fingers tightened around his, then fell still. Outside thunder rolled, the first in years. When dawn came, the rain finally fell. It began as a whisper, then a roar, fat drops striking the temple roofs, running down the stone faces of gods that had forgotten compassion. The people rejoiced. The priests declared it a sign of forgiveness. But in the palace, the Pharaoh knelt beside the queen's still form, his tears mixing with the rain that streamed through the open window. He whispered, "If this is forgiveness, I want none of it." He ordered her burial not in Thebes, but in the heart of Neferkare, beneath the unfinished temple. The priests protested. No one of mortal birth had ever been entombed beside a pharaoh. But he silenced them with a glance. When the last stone was laid, he sealed the chamber himself, pressing his hand into the wet plaster, as if to leave a heartbeat behind. Then he turned to his court and said, "The gods are dead. I have buried them with her." That night, the lightning struck the horizon, and the desert seemed to catch fire. The reflection danced in his eyes, a city burning before it was even born. And somewhere in the storm, a new voice rose, not Neferu's, not divine, but his own. A voice that would change Egypt forever. The rain that had come with Neferu's death did not last. By the third dawn, the clouds were gone and the sun blazed again, merciless as ever. But for Neferkare, the world had changed. He walked through the palace in silence, his footsteps echoing through empty halls. The courtiers whispered that their god had turned ghostly. He no longer spoke of the Nile, or the people, or even of his father. He spoke only of her. He said her spirit lived in the light now, that at dawn, when the sun rose over the horizon, he could hear her voice in the wind. And so, in his grief, he began to build. The city of Neferkare, once a dream of love and renewal, became an obsession. He summoned every mason, every sculptor, every scribe. The sound of chisels and hammers filled the desert night. Torches burned without rest. He told his builders, "Stone is eternity's language. If gods will not speak, I will." Under his command, a new temple began to rise, vast, stark, unlike any Egypt had ever seen. There were no idols, no walls carved with prayers. Only columns open to the sky, shaped to catch the first rays of dawn and scatter them through the city like fire. At the temple's center stood a single slab of polished alabaster. "This," said the pharaoh, "will be her throne." The architects dared to ask, "And where shall yours be, Majesty?" He smiled, distant. "Beside hers in light. We will rule as one forever." The old gods vanished from Neferkare. Their statues were removed, their names erased from temple walls. The priests of Ammonius, driven from the city, fled south to Thebes. The pharaoh issued a new decree. "There is no god but the light. It shines on all. It speaks to none." His scribes wrote the words on papyrus and walls alike, his seal pressed into clay like a divine scar. And the people obeyed, because obedience is a habit, even when faith is gone. But light can blind as easily as it illuminates. The sun that once gave life to Neferkare now punished it. The workers, forced to labor through the heat of the day, began to collapse where they stood. Their corpses were carried out and buried in the sand beyond the walls. Rumors spread that the Pharaoh demanded silence in the streets so he could hear the voice of the queen's spirit. Others said he forbade shadows, that every servant in the palace must carry a torch at night so darkness could not touch her name. Each day he spent hours in the temple, standing before the alabaster slab. The light from the open ceiling fell on him like molten gold. He would close his eyes, whisper, and smile as if hearing an answer no one else could. Sometimes he laughed softly, as if sharing a secret. Sometimes he wept. Mentuhotep, the last of his old council still permitted an audience, watched in sorrow. He found the Pharaoh standing motionless in the temple one afternoon, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun trembled like a living thing. "Majesty," said the priest, "you have made Egypt a furnace. The people suffer. The gods are dust," the Pharaoh interrupted. "Then so shall we be." The Pharaoh turned, and for a moment Mentuhotep saw in his face not a king, not a madman, but a child, the same child who once asked why the sun hides behind clouds. "Tell me, old friend," he whispered, "if I kneel before the light, who kneels before me?" "The dead," said the priest. The Pharaoh smiled faintly. "Then they will make a fine congregation." As months passed, the lines between life and death blurred. The palace became a shrine, the servants moving like shadows, their eyes downcast. The queen's old chamber was kept immaculate, flowers replaced each morning though no one entered. Every dawn, the Pharaoh emerged to greet the sun with arms outstretched, his bare chest painted with streaks of gold dust. His voice rang through the air. "Light of the living and the lost, I am your sun and your mirror. Burn me clean of darkness." The people gathered outside the temple gates, some weeping, some worshipping, most afraid. They no longer knew if they served a man or a flame. One evening, a dust storm swept through the desert, swallowing the city. The sky turned red, the air filled with sand that stung the skin and eyes. The workers fled to their huts, the torches were extinguished, and Neferkare vanished beneath the storm's roar. Only the temple remained lit. From its open roof, light, unnatural and steady, poured upward into the swirling dark, a pillar of gold defying the storm. Those who survived swore that they saw the Pharaoh standing in the heart of it, untouched, his arms raised, his voice carried on the wind. "You cannot destroy light. You can only scatter it." When the storm passed, the city lay half buried. But the temple still stood, gleaming under the morning sun, and every grain of sand around it turned to glass. The priests in exile called it an abomination. The people called it a miracle. The Pharaoh called it proof. He believed then, truly believed, that he had found eternity. The desert shimmered like a mirror. From horizon to horizon stretched the skeleton of a city made of light. Neferkare, the Pharaoh's impossible dream, half born, half doomed. Its avenues ran straight as sunbeams. Its white walls threw back the dawn in a blaze that could blind a man. To look upon it from afar was to stare into the eye of day itself. In the center rose the temple of the living sun, a mountain of limestone and alabaster whose roof was open to heaven. At its heart, beneath the ceiling of burning sky, stood the alabaster throne of Neferu, and beside it the seat of Neferkare, empty most hours except when the king came to speak to the light. Each morning before the first cry of ibis, he walked the eastern causeway barefoot, robed only in white. The guards bowed and kept their eyes to the sand. In the silence before sunrise, he could almost hear her footsteps echoing beside his own. When the rim of the sun appeared, he raised his arms. "Behold the dawn of endless life," he whispered, and for a moment he believed it. Behind him, scribes hurried to record every word. Their scrolls multiplied like roots, spreading his new doctrine across Egypt. The light has no name. It is everywhere. It judges none, blesses none, and forgets none. The Pharaoh is its voice. The old gods vanished from speech. The name of Ammonius was chiseled from walls. Offerings ceased. Those who defied the decree were marked with ash and sent to labor in the quarries that built his city of glass. He told himself it was mercy. If the gods had failed mankind, then mankind would rebuild heaven from stone. At first, Neferkare flourished. The sun struck its white avenues and set them ablaze with brilliance. Travelers approaching from the desert saw its towers floating in heat like the gates of another world. Pilgrims came from every province to gaze upon it, and for a time the people believed again, not in the gods, but in the man who had replaced them. They called him Are made flesh. Children were named after him. Merchants offered prayers to the direction of his temple. The priests who had once cursed him now crept back, begging for favor. And yet, within the palace, the air was heavy with unease. The court had learned to smile too quickly, to agree too easily. Servants moved as if afraid of their own shadows, for the Pharaoh had decreed that no darkness should remain in his city. At night, thousands of lamps burned in the streets until the sky itself seemed to retreat from the blaze. One evening, Mentuhotep was brought before him, the last time the old priest would look upon his king. The Pharaoh sat at the foot of Neferu's throne, the reflected light turning his skin to gold. Around him the air shimmered with heat from braziers filled with burning resin. "You are dying, old friend," he said without looking up. The priest's voice rasped. "So is Egypt." Neferkare smiled faintly. "Egypt is reborn." "It starves," said Mentuhotep. "Your harvests fail, your people flee, and you worship a silence that devours everything." "Silence," the Pharaoh murmured, "is the only truth that never lies." The priest coughed, leaning heavily on his staff. "You once sought to be human. Now you have become a sun that burns even its own children." At that, the Pharaoh rose. His eyes glowed with fevered light. "If the light kills, it is because men refuse to open their eyes." Mentuhotep bowed, tears cutting lines through the dust on his face. "Then may the gods forgive you, Majesty, for they have already forsaken us." He was carried from the hall before dawn. By evening, his heart had stopped. The next morning, the Pharaoh ordered a festival in his honor. "For all who serve the light," he said, and the drums drowned out the sound of mourning. The years blurred into one long summer. The Nile faltered again, its waters receded, leaving salt and memory behind. Fields withered, yet the city grew higher, brighter, more impossible. The pharaoh no longer visited Thebes or Memphis. Ambassadors waited months for an audience. He surrounded himself with mirrors, walls of polished copper that caught the sunlight and hurled it in every direction. Wherever he walked, his reflection followed, 1,000 versions of himself gazing back. He began to sleep less, eat little. The physicians whispered that his pulse had slowed, that his blood ran cool. "He is becoming what he worships," one said, "light without shadow." At night, he dreamed of Neferu. She stood upon the river, her hair flowing like dark water, her eyes the color of dawn. "Come back," he would plead. She shook her head. "You built your heaven. You no longer need me. I built it for you. And for yourself." Then the dream would dissolve into fire, and he would wake, whispering her name into the dark that no longer existed. The architects feared him now. When he ordered a new chamber built within the temple, a room without doors, its walls of glass and gold, none dared question. He called it the Chamber of Eternal Day. There, he said, he would conquer death itself. The chamber was designed so that sunlight poured through it from dawn to dusk, refracted endlessly through mirrors and crystal. The builders protested that no man could stand within it for long. The heat alone would kill him. The pharaoh only smiled. "Then I will burn away what is mortal." As the chamber neared completion, omens multiplied. A comet blazed across the sky for 7 nights. The sacred ibis fled the city. A tremor shook the foundations of the temple. The people began to whisper that the sun itself had grown weary of its reflection. But the pharaoh no longer listened. He saw these signs not as warnings but as greetings, the heavens preparing to receive him. He told his scribes, "When I step into the chamber, write these words upon the walls of Egypt. The light has taken back its own." The chamber of eternal day stood at the heart of Neferkare like a wand made of light. From the outside, it seemed a simple cube of alabaster and gold, but within, every surface was mirror or crystal, every angle sharpened to catch and multiply the sun. No shadow lived there, even breath seemed made of flame. For 7 days artisans polished the mirrors until they could see the pulse in their own eyes. Then the pharaoh dismissed them. He wished to finish the work himself. He carried in the last fragment, a disk of clear quartz, cut thin as a drop of water, and set it above the doorway so that the first light of dawn would fall directly upon his throne. The throne itself was carved from the same alabaster that covered Neferu's tomb below. In its center he placed a single lotus blossom. It had been her favorite flower. When all was prepared, he ordered the chamber sealed from the world. The night before his ascension, the city held its breath. Outside the temple, crowds knelt in the sand, waiting. Some wept. Others prayed that the sun would rise again once he entered. Even the priests of the new cult, who had long chanted his praises, avoided one another's eyes. Inside, the pharaoh knelt before the empty throne. He touched the cold stone and whispered, "If light is truth, let it take me whole. If darkness follows, let it follow me alone." Then he rose, stripped of every ornament, and stepped into the chamber. The doors closed behind him with a sound like the closing of an age. At dawn, the first ray of the sun struck the quartz disk. It shattered into 1,000 lines of fire that ricocheted through the room, multiplying until every inch of air burned. Witnesses outside said the temple blazed like the sun itself had fallen to earth. Inside, Neferkare stood still. His skin glowed. The heat seared through him. The light filled his eyes until they bled. He could no longer tell where his body ended and the radiance began. He saw the Nile flashing below like a serpent of gold. He saw the faces of his people, every farmer, every child, every soldier, woven together in a single blinding pattern. He saw Nefer's smile dissolve into brightness. He whispered, "I see you." The mirrors cracked. The sound was like the breaking of glass and bone together. The chamber shook. The guards at the gate fell to their knees as a column of fire burst through the roof, a cry without sound that reached even to the deserts beyond Thebes. When the light faded, the doors were fused shut. For 3 days no one entered. The priests fasted and wailed. The people waited for a sign. On the 4th dawn, the doors burst outward. The guards found the interior blackened, every surface fused into glass. In the center sat the Pharaoh's throne, empty except for a faint impression burned into the stone. 2 hands, 2 eyes, a human shape made of absence. Some swore they saw light still pulsing within the mirrors, as if it breathed. Others said they heard a whisper echoing through the hall. I am here. I am everywhere. Neferkare never recovered. Without the Pharaoh's command, the city faltered, trade stopped, and granaries emptied. The architects fled, fearing curse or madness. The priests of the old gods returned, preaching that the Sun King had been consumed by his own pride. And yet the people still climbed the temple steps each morning. When the first light touched the roof, they bowed, believing that their Lord shone down upon them from the heavens. But the light no longer warmed. It only blinded. In the following months, the Nile turned against them once more. The floods came early, violent, tearing through the fields and drowning entire villages. Crocodiles floated dead in the current. Pestilence followed. Famine returned. To the south, Nubian warlords advanced along the river. To the north, the delta cities declared independence. Egypt fractured like the mirrors of its lost king. The High Council met for the last time in the half-ruined palace. No one dared sit upon the throne. One general said, "The gods punish us for abandoning them." Another answered, "The gods died when he entered the fire." No one spoke again. In the heart of the temple, the chamber of eternal day remained sealed. The walls still glimmered faintly at dawn, as if something inside remembered the shape of the sun. Birds avoided it. The air around it hummed like a hell breath. Travelers who passed through the ruins at night sometimes saw a figure walking along the roofline, tall, robed in white, glowing faintly. When they called out, it turned its face toward them, and they saw only light where eyes should have been. They fled, whispering that the Pharaoh lived still, watching, waiting for the world to understand what he had become. When the light vanished, Egypt became a land of echoes. The songs that had once filled Neferkare turned to silence. The marble courtyards were buried beneath drifting dunes. The people who had called their ruler Are made flesh now spoke his name only in whispers. The city was dying, and with it the dream of eternity. From the south came war. The Nubian kings, long patient, advanced along the Nile with bronze-tipped spears and black banners. The old garrison stood empty. The commanders who had sworn loyalty to the Sun King were gone, either to the famine or to the desert. They marched through villages where the people bowed not in reverence but in exhaustion. They found temples stripped of idols, shrines filled with nothing but dust. When they reached Neferkare, they stopped. The city gleamed even in ruin, its white stones reflecting the noon sun like frozen fire. The invaders dared not enter at first. Their leader, an aging warlord named Keshar, lifted his eyes to the broken spire of the temple and murmured, "No man builds such a place without calling gods down upon himself." Inside the walls, the remaining priests of the light gathered in the shadow of the great stairway. They were pale, thin, their skin blistered from years beneath the unshaded sun. One among them, a young scribe named Tanan, still believed. "The Pharaoh lives," he insisted. "He became the light. We must guard this city until he returns." But the others shook their heads. "The light devours all who serve it," one whispered. "He will not return. He never left." That night, Tanan crept into the temple alone. He passed through corridors melted smooth by heat, through halls where columns had cracked and fallen like bones. When he reached the chamber of eternal day, he pressed his ear against the sealed door. From within came the faintest hum, neither wind nor voice, but something alive. He fell to his knees, tears streaking his face. "Majesty," he whispered, "forgive us." The hum answered with a sigh of air and the sound, almost, of a heartbeat. The next morning, Keshar's army breached the gates. They found the streets empty, the fountains dry. In the palace, they uncovered gold beyond counting, but most turned to ash when touched, as if cursed by heat. When they reached the temple, Keshar ordered the doors opened. His soldiers hammered the seals, broke through the molten stone, and entered. They emerged moments later, screaming. Their eyes were seared, their skin burned, though no flame had touched them. They claimed that within the chamber stood a figure made of light, neither man nor god, motionless yet alive. Keshar ordered the temple sealed again and declared the city forbidden. "Let no man steal from a son," he said. His army departed, leaving the ruins to the wind. Centuries passed. The Nile changed its course. Sand swallowed the avenues of Neferkare, the white walls fading into the dunes like ghostly bones. The priests of Ammonius returned to power. They erased the Sun King's name from every scroll, every monument. In its place, they wrote a single phrase: "He who burned the gods." But memory is stubborn. Travelers still spoke of a light that glowed beneath the desert at night. Caravan guides avoided the horizon where the city once stood, saying the air there was cursed and the stars dimmed above it. 1,000 years later, a shepherd wandering far from his flock stumbled upon a ridge of stone jutting from the sand. Curious, he brushed away the dust and saw carvings faint but clear, the outline of a man seated beside a woman, their hands nearly touching, the sun rising between them. He did not know their names. He only felt the warmth of the stone, though the night was cold. He whispered a prayer, not to gods, but to the light that had never left. And somewhere deep beneath his feet, a spark flickered in answer. Thus ended the reign of Neferkare, the last son of the sun. And thus began his eternity. the wind returned to Egypt first. It came hissing out of the west, lifting the dust that had slept for generations in the ruins of Akare. The sand moved through streets once paved with marble, whispering against toppled statues. Each gust carried the same wordless question: where was the god who promised that the light would never fade? Inside the palace, Neferkare heard the storm and smiled. The desert reclaims its own, he murmured. He had not left the temple for many days. His beard had turned white, his body thin as papyrus. He still wore linen painted with gold dust, but it no longer gleamed. The mirrors that once multiplied his glory now stood dark, cracked by heat. Below, Egypt had begun to devour itself. Famine stalked the villages. The river, low and bitter, turned children's lips blue. Armies sent north returned in tatters. The south no longer answered his summons. The priests he had spared whispered rebellion in the markets, and every night the city glowed with the fires of revolt. The Sun King ruled an empire of ashes. That morning, his general Qutep came to the throne room, dusty, exhausted, armor dented. He bowed once and said, "Majesty, the outer walls will not hold another day." Neferkare looked past him to the door where sunlight fell across the floor like a sword. "Then we will fight in the light," he said. Qutep hesitated. "The garrisons are starving. The priests of Ammonius have joined the rebels. If you open the gates, they may spare the city." "Spare it?" The Pharaoh's voice was soft, almost kind. "They will rebuild the temples, chain the people, and bury her name." "No, General. The light will not kneel again." The soldier's eyes wavered. "Then forgive me." It was the only warning he gave. When he lifted his head, his sword was already drawn. The blade struck the dais with a ringing note. The Pharaoh did not move. The guards, loyal to the end, fell upon the traitor. In the struggle that followed, blood spattered the golden tiles. When it was over, Qutep lay dying at the king's feet. Neferkare looked down at him with neither anger nor pity. "Even you," he whispered, "seek the darkness." The general coughed, blood on his lips. "No, Majesty. I seek peace." "Then you will have it soon." He touched the man's forehead in blessing. When Qutep's breath stilled, the Pharaoh turned to his remaining guards. "Open the gates. Let the rebels come. I would see Egypt once more before I end." They obeyed. By nightfall, the city was under siege. The torches of the rebels ringed the horizon, a necklace of fire around the dying sun. From the temple roof, the Pharaoh watched them gather, a sea of movement and fury. He felt no fear, only weariness. Mentuhotep's prophecy came back to him, faint as incense smoke, a crown as a cage. The longer you wear it, the less you remember the sky. He looked upward. The stars were hidden by smoke. "Then perhaps," he said, "it is time to remember." In the deepest chamber of the temple, he prepared himself for the end. He removed the crown and set it on the alabaster slab beside Neferu's. He washed his hands in a bowl of Nile water gone brackish with dust, then anointed his body with oil. The ritual was simple, ancient, one last conversation with eternity. When the priests of Ammonius burst through the outer courts, they found the temple strangely calm. The corridors glowed with reflected flame from the fires outside, and the scent of resin filled the air. Somewhere within, a voice was chanting, not in the language of prayer, but of farewell. The rebels reached the central hall just as the roof began to crumble. Thereupon, the Pharaoh sat the Pharaoh, upright, eyes open, the last of his guards fallen around him. The invading leader, a former priest named Painshi, raised his torch. "Where is your god now?" he shouted. Neferkare smiled. "Everywhere you dare to look." The torchlight flared. A column cracked, then another. The roof groaned like the breath of a dying giant. The rebels fled as the temple collapsed in a roar of stone and fire. When the dust settled, Neferkare was gone. Only at dawn did the wind clear the smoke. The first rays of the sun broke across the ruins, and there, half buried beneath the fallen columns, the conquerors found the pharaoh's body. He was still seated upright, the light striking his face. In his hands he held the lotus carved from alabaster, the one he had laid for Neferu. His lips were parted, as if he were still speaking to her. Painshi bowed, overcome despite himself. "Bury him where he sits," he ordered. "Let the desert guard its own flame." They covered the chamber in sand. By nightfall, the city was silent again. The smoke lingered for days. It clung to the broken towers and drifted across the Nile, turning the sunrise gray. When the wind finally shifted, it carried with it the smell of limestone dust and burnt cedar, the scent of an empire's funeral. The victors moved through the ruins of Neferkare in silence. No songs of triumph, no laughter. Even the jackals kept their distance. The city that had once blinded the world now stared upward with 1,000 shattered eyes. Painshi, the priest-turned-general who had led the rebellion, ordered the dead to be counted. They stopped counting at 10,000. The rest they left to the sand. Among the rubble of the great temple, the soldiers uncovered strange relics. Bronze mirrors fused into black glass. Walls melted into smooth surfaces where their own reflections seemed to move without them. Some said the light itself was trapped there, sleeping. Others said it waited to awaken when the world grew proud again. Painshi would not allow them to touch anything. "Burn what can burn," he commanded, "and bury the rest. No man should hold the tools of a god." Yet when he reached the inner sanctum, where Neferkare sat entombed beneath the fallen roof, even he hesitated. The pharaoh's face was serene. The flesh had not blackened nor shrunk. It gleamed faintly, as if the sun still warmed it. The lotus lay across his knees unbroken. For a long moment, Painshi could not speak. At last he whispered, "He was right about one thing, light does not die." He ordered the tomb sealed with stone and sand. On its surface he had carved a single line. "Here rests the king who would be the sun." Then he turned his army north, leaving Neferkare to the wind. In Thebes, the priests of Ammonius restored the old hymns. They rebuilt the temples, rededicated the altars, and proclaimed that order had returned. But the people did not cheer. They worked in silence, glancing southward at dusk, toward the horizon where the desert shimmered faintly like a hidden fire. They whispered that the Sun King still watched them, that his eyes were the dawn and the dusk, opening and closing upon the world. Mothers told their children to behave, or the light would find them even in darkness. Farmers left offerings of bread on their rooftops at sunrise, just in case. The priests pretended not to notice. Years became decades. Sand swallowed the roads leading to Neferkare. Floods erased its name from maps. But stories endure where monuments fail. Bards sang of the Pharaoh who loved a mortal and defied the gods. Some said he was punished, turned into fire. Others said he ascended and became the sun itself, shining equally on all because he could no longer choose whom to love. His legend spread far beyond Egypt. Phoenician sailors carried tales of a king who built a city of glass in the desert. Greek travelers spoke of Helios man, who dared to steal the chariot of the sun. To each people he became something different, a warning, a miracle, a memory of what men might become if they believed too fiercely. And so the centuries passed. Empires rose and crumbled. The names of new kings filled the scrolls, each certain that their monuments would last forever. But in the hearts of those who worked the river, one name remained, not written, but spoken in the hush before sunrise. Neferkare, the last son of the sun. The pharaoh who burned brighter than the gods, and for that brightness was consumed. Silence. No wind. No sand. No time. Only darkness, deep and endless, folding upon itself like water without surface or depth. From that darkness came a single sound, the slow beat of a heart. Then another. Then the echo of breath. Neferkare awoke. He felt the weight of stone above him, the cool press of earth. When he opened his eyes, there was no light, yet he could see, not with sight, but with memory. He saw his city in ruin, his people scattered, the temple buried beneath dunes. He saw his own body, seated upright beneath the rubble, lips still curved around the last word he ever spoke, her name. And then the darkness spoke back. You built a city for the living and turned it into a tomb. He turned toward the voice. Shapes gathered out of the void, tall, robed figures whose faces were stars. Who judges me? He asked. The voice answered. We are the ones you denied. They led him through corridors of shadow, walls etched with every deed of his life. The air shimmered with whispering souls. Each whisper was a prayer he had ignored, a life his pride had consumed. He walked barefoot upon the path of memory. With every step, the scenes unfolded around him. His childhood beneath the temple, the laughter he had forgotten, the first blood he spilled in the name of the gods. He saw Neferu again, standing by the river. She smiled, but her eyes were sorrowful. You sought to bring light to the world, she said, but you forgot that light needs shadow to be seen. I built our dream, he said. I gave them the sun. You gave them blindness. Her form dissolved into flame. When the smoke cleared, the path continued downward. They came to the Hall of Two Truths, where the souls of kings were weighed against the feather of Maat. The chamber stretched beyond sight. The floor was glass and beneath it flowed the souls of the dead like a river of fire. Upon a dais sat Osiris, lord of the underworld, his skin green as papyrus, his eyes as cold as eternity. Before him stood Anubis, the jackal-headed god, holding scales forged from gold and shadow. Neferkare bowed. I am Pharaoh, he said. son of Ra, born beneath the eclipse. Anubis's voice was quiet. And yet you stand before us mortal. The king smiled faintly. Then I have learned something even gods forget. Anubis lifted the scale. Your heart, he said, must be weighed. From Neferkare's chest, light flowed, a small, trembling orb that pulsed like the last ember of a fire. He watched as Anubis placed it upon one side of the scale. On the other, a feather shimmered with colors no living eye could name. For a moment, the scales balanced. Then the heart began to sink. From the darkness rose a murmur, the voices of those who had died in his wars, the workers who had perished building his city, the children who had starved in famine. He called himself the sun. He left us in shadow. He forgot our names. The feather trembled. The balance tilted. But then came another sound, soft, like a breath. A single voice. He remembered mine. The scales steadied. Neferu stood beside him again, radiant, her form woven from light. She reached out and placed her hand upon his heart. Even gods may be forgiven, she said. Osiris leaned forward. You defied the divine, yet you learned what it means to be human. Your heart is heavy with both pride and love. So it shall not be devoured, but carried. Neferkare looked at him in wonder. Where? Osiris's gaze was the horizon itself. Where it belongs, among those who remember. The river of fire stilled. The air grew warm. Above them the darkness thinned, and through it poured the first dawn. The Pharaoh closed his eyes and felt its touch, not blinding, not burning, but gentle. He whispered, Light. And this time it answered. The dawn that rose over the underworld was unlike any he had known. It had no sun, no color, only warmth, as though every grain of darkness had remembered what it once was. Neferkare followed Neferu along the shining path that led upward from the hall. Around them, the void blossomed into endless corridors of light. Each wall was a window, and through each window he saw another life, his own, replayed not as he remembered it, but as others had felt it. He saw the soldier who had died at his side on the frontier, whispering a prayer to be remembered. He saw the farmer who had labored beneath the Nile sun, grateful for the grain his decrees had once stored. He saw a child born in the famine who had lived to see rain, dancing in the streets of Thebes. For every cruelty he had caused, there was a fragment of kindness, small, unnoticed, yet still glowing. It was not enough to redeem him, but it was enough to make him human. They came to a field of reeds, endless and green, its surface rippling with silver light. This is the Sekitaru, said Neferu. The field of reeds. The paradise of those who live truth. He looked across it and saw countless souls, walking, laughing, working the soil as if the world had begun anew. Each carried their own harvest of memory, each sowed what they had been. Neferkare turned to her. Do I remain here? She shook her head. You are not finished. Then what remains? The living. The light thickened, folded, and became water. Suddenly, he stood again upon the shore of the Nile, but the river was no longer his. Its banks had shifted. The pyramids of later kings loomed where his city had been. The sky was fuller, the stars strange. Time had passed like a flood, carrying away everything he once knew. He saw fishermen hauling nets from the shallows, unaware of the ghosts that watched them. He saw merchants loading barges, temples gleaming with new names. His own was gone. A whisper rose on the wind, his own voice, from some forgotten century of worship. I will live forever. He smiled sadly. And so you did, my arrogance. Neferkare placed her hand upon his arm. Look closer. Beyond the bustle of the living, he saw a group of children playing in the dust. One of them traced a circle in the sand and drew lines within it, the crude rays of a sun. What game is that? Another child asked. It's the old king, said the boy. The one who loved the light. They laughed and went on with their play, but the mark remained, a small sun carved into the earth. Neferkare felt warmth in his chest. They remember. Not your name, said Neferu, but the light you carried. That is enough, he whispered. The vision dissolved. They stood once more within the river of stars. Before them rose a gate carved from living fire, its shape ever-changing, its threshold the border between remembrance and rest. A voice, either male nor female, either divine nor mortal, spoke from everywhere at once. Neferkare, son of Are, child of dust. You sought eternity in stone and found it in the heart. What will you do with what remains? He bowed his head. I will walk beside the dawn until the end of all suns. The gate opened, and the light poured through him, not as judgment, but as understanding. He saw the universe unfold, every birth, every death, every whisper of kindness and cruelty interwoven into one endless pattern. He saw that no flame ever truly dies, it only changes form. He saw that the gods themselves were memories of men, and that men were the dreams of gods. And in that moment, Neferkare laughed, a sound of release, pure and human. Neferu smiled. Come, my king! The journey is done. Together they stepped into the fire, and the fire became dawn. The dawn of the afterlife did not rise suddenly. It unfurled, gentle as breath. The river of stars dimmed, the reeds swayed once more in golden wind. In their shimmer, Neferkare saw not heaven or hell, but continuity, the same Nile that had cradled Egypt now flowing through eternity, unending. He and Neferu walked along its bank. Each step left ripples of light that lingered behind them, forming constellations where they passed. The air smelled of papyrus and myrrh, and in the distance, he could hear voices, not cries of worship, but laughter, work, and song. Is this paradise? He asked. Neferu smiled. It is remembrance. They came upon a bridge of stones spanning the river. Upon it sat a figure cloaked in shadow. Its face was hidden, but its presence felt familiar, vast, calm, ancient. Who waits? Neferkare asked. The figure spoke in his own voice. I am what remains when the name fades. He understood. Myself. The shadow nodded. You sought to be a god and became a lesson instead. Do you regret it? Neferkare looked back toward the horizon. Through the mist, he could see faint echoes of Egypt, the towers of Akare half buried in sand, the Nile gleaming like molten bronze. He saw his people still rising and falling through ages, still seeking light in every form. "No," he said. "I only regret how long it took me to see that they were already divine." The shadow smiled, and its shape dissolved into light, merging with his own. He turned to Neferu. "I thought eternity was power," he said softly. "But it is mercy." "And mercy," she whispered, "is light." They stood together as the horizon burned with new suns, thousands of them, each one a life, each one a prayer unanswered but still heard. Neferu raised her hand toward one of them. "Do you see? Every flame that ever lived finds its place again." He nodded. "Then I will watch over them, not as a god, but as their dawn." And with that, he stepped forward,